All right, let's get right to it. Obviously, these writings are going to be semi-distractive, so I better just explain what they are first, and then you can just get over it. We'll talk about that in just a second. I want to answer something I mentioned to my libertarian friends about preemptive force, so that's not misunderstood. And then over here, the guy from Genesis 9 is here now. He's got a family. You see concentric circles. You see what's called the thin blue line of police. And then you see sheriff, governor, a mob. I'm not introducing anything new that you don't see on your Facebook feed every day, okay? The long arm of George Soros, so says Newt Gingrich. So shocks Fox into hushing that up very quickly. Nevertheless, here's the long arm of the outside government. It wouldn't really even matter what government it was, whether it was federal or in the United States. This is a principle that would cover any similar scenario. I'll explain the dotted lines being on the inside over here versus the outside over there, depending on if you're a red state or a blue state, and even if that's always cuts across the board, because it doesn't. And so there's going to be a lot in play here. In these principles. Okay, let me just say something to my libertarian friends, or really anybody that might take offense or exception to the whole preemptive force thing. This triangle here, it's a basic way of thinking through deadly force and justified it. You know, you see this with, stand your ground laws and police, of course, if they have to argue in court for their innocence, if they were feared for their lives. You'd want to ask these kind of questions. This triangle of deadly force thing, that you need the person, the aggressor, needs a combination of these three things to make it a credible situation in which you did fear for your life: opportunity, capability, and intent. So, a couple of examples that were used. One, somebody being in a jail cell. Suppose somebody is like a little old lady is not going to meet this standard, right? What about somebody behind bars who's 7 feet, he's like The Rock, and so he's got capability. And then he tells you through the bars of the prisons, hey, as soon as I get a chance, I'm going to strangle you. I'm going to kill you. So you got intent too. But under the circumstance, so you can't just put a bullet in his head. Why? Because he has no opportunity. You get the idea? And so, and turn that triangle around in several different ways. You say, what about these cases where somebody has an airsoft gun? If you have one of those orange caps or whatever. Well, here's the thing. You can paint a real gun, part of it orange. There's ways to get around this where the police still have to think through this. Maybe he has a gun on his dashboard, on his passenger side floor or whatever. Turns out they were wrong, or they weren't, so these are the kind of things that have to be thought through. But preemptive, if you have credible reason. By the way, this applies not just to deadly force, but also to legitimate forms of assembly. Ronald Reagan made the argument in his defense in the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 1940s, or was it early 50s by then? Now it's still the late 40s. That yes, communists, namely the real actual Communist Party, for example, yes, you have free speech, even if I disagree with you. There's that whole line about that. But if the government has credible intelligence that a group is organizing a violent overthrow of a government, they are duty-bound to act on it. And not once they see the dead bodies chopped up in the woods, but when they have the intelligence. Okay. So just bringing that in, just to think through what we're talking about, what we're not talking about. So we're going to talk about a lot of introductory 101 principles, but we're not going to do this like I would normally do. So for example, I did the class in 2012. I talked about just use of force. I talked about just war. I talked about the Second Amendment in terms of constitutional law. We're not going to do that. I will mention a couple of those things, but I'm not arguing for the Constitution anymore. That train has left the station. That's done. That's over. We're going to talk turkey here. But in order to do that, we do have to make our way through some introductory principles for the sensitive, to remind them that nope, this is just Genesis 9. We're just bringing those principles forward into this situation as well. So this is a collective duty now. We talk about natural right, flowing out to what Bastiat called a collective organization of the right to lawful defense. That would also then imply capital punishment. Okay? Now, it's important not to misunderstand this. Whether we're talking about capital punishment or a military or police, collective force is not about transferring the object of offense, namely what has been offended, violated, what has been violated from being against the image to being against the state. And that first hits us in capital punishment. We don't want to misunderstand that. So Numbers 35 carries this forward in the law of Israel. The murderer shall be put to death in verse 16. Again, there's that distinction between killing and murdering. It's assumed that they are distinct. 1 Kings 2:31, Joab, the commander of Israel's army, is said to shed blood without cause, implying, and he was an instrument of the state, there would have been such a thing in his position as shedding blood with cause. You have the cities of refuge in the Mosaic Law that again assume this. Use the word vengeance in that case. So again, you have to do theology on the concept level, not just the word level. Same thing with ethics in Scripture. That doesn't go away. But God demanded for there to be these capital crimes. Okay? So the necessity of self-defense includes the evil of long-term national suicide. If I could, and I didn't draw this on there, but if everything we said in the first session was true about the duty to defend one's own life and the life of those under your care and your own life for the sake of those under your care, then it is also your duty to not die as a group. You say, well, what? What is that? Well, have you cracked open a history book? That is kind of common. So the idea in the Heidelberg, in the language that's there, that I harm not myself, and that included rushing out into danger or anything that tendeth thereunto. Remember that language. That includes this, okay? So it includes intentional bodily harm, even that which does not kill an individual all at once, but that which you know has a great tendency toward unnatural death, violent death. It does not say that I harm myself if it takes a while. So here's a biblical example. The otherwise righteous king Hezekiah. Now Hezekiah, if he was here with a crown on his head, he would have a lot more than these people. He would have a whole nation of people under his care, right? Okay, so he had a wicked moment. It's a moment that, as he was looking into it, he was looking into the future of a moment in the future that he would not have to endure. When the Babylonian officials, you might remember this story, were visiting him, and he gave them a tour showing off the temple gold, the prophet Isaiah rebuked him. You can see this in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 16 through 19. He said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried off to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And check this out. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, why not, if there will be peace and security in my days? Suicide of one's own people group is murder of the offspring. Let me say that again. Suicide of one's people group is murder of the offspring. We talked about that before under the sixth commandment, that we don't have a right to let go of the republic. You actually don't have that right, and you have the duty to do the opposite. Here, from the perspective of life, it is violently selfish to say, as long as there's peace in my day. And it follows from the greater to the lesser that selling oneself into slavery or any kind of slower self-imposed genocide is enslavement of one's offspring, the selling of them into captivity. It is bloody hatred multiplied by the whole people group, right? So instead of just these few, if you're to sell them into slavery or just to stand by and watch it happen, same thing with the group. It's still guilt. And I know we speak all the time of lacking motive, opportunity, and numbers of, say, an Adolf Hitler. You know, when we're talking about total depravity, we want to say, well, I would be Hitler, just minus motive, opportunity, and numbers. I'm that bad. And so it's nice and cute to talk about that in the mirror when we're talking about private spirituality. But I beg to differ, because as that picture of Hezekiah shows us, and it reads our mail, we may say we are not kings, but we have more wealth and more ability to stop evil than any earthly king that ever lived, and have in our own families, within the church and all those people groups that are under our care, we have offspring that far outnumber any of their countries by tens of millions. And we are at this moment deliberately watching their genocide in slow motion like suicidal cabbages. So by that standard, per capita, amount of people under your care, amount of power to do something about it, that would make American conservative Christians the most wicked people that have ever existed on the face of the earth. By that standard. But why shouldn't you apply that standard of the sixth commandment? Okay? So that is just not just food for thought. You need to deal with that. There's a reason we're in this place. That things that happen under your watch. Now we have relative amounts of power. I understand that. The principle still holds though. Okay? Now, all of this includes the right and the wisdom. So this right of self-defense, this duty of preserving you and your offspring, that includes the right and the wisdom of fleeing an area to preserve life. So it's not just Calvin fleeing France, or those under Bloody Mary fleeing to the continent, or whatever, or historical examples that you can use biblically in both, for example, Habakkuk 2:2 and in Matthew 24:15 through 20. The Jews before the Babylonian siege in Habakkuk and those besieged by the Romans in AD 70 were counseled by God to heed the signs and to flee where the brunt of the violent attack would be. And so, for example, and this is not me making light of it, it's just the opposite. If you live in a place like in one of those blue state cities, it is not unbiblical. It is not a lack of trust in God, a lack of faith, selfish toward other people who can't do the same. You may think about that as a counterbalance, and that's fine. But in and of itself, it is not selfish or lack of faith or unspiritual or anything like that to flee such a place at such a time. Okay? There's things that we would normally get into, like the morality of serving. So, okay, I believe all this, but being in one of those positions, that's not for Christians. The Bible treats military service as permissible. In Luke's gospel, soldiers asked Jesus, "And we, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusations, and be content with your wages." That's Luke 3:14. That'd have been a great time if Jesus was a pacifist to say, because the soldiers just flat out asked him, "What should we do in our solderness?" Been a great time for Jesus to say, "Stop being a soldier." But he didn't say that. Okay, so it's assumed that being a soldier, serving for a military, is not in and of itself sinful. The vocation of Cornelius in Acts 10 was not negatively addressed at conversion. Likewise with the imperial guard, addressed by Paul's message in Philippians 1:13. The assumption is that military service is not in and of itself sinful. Now, we move out one circle. Forget about the military for just a second. Forget about just war if we even get to it. Let's talk about these circles for just a second here. The duties of police and sheriffs. And, sometimes natural law just hits the nail right on the head. To protect and serve. Yeah, that's right. Protect and serve. You're serving the public, i.e. you're a servant, taking this individual right, and you're just making it collective. And what does that mean? It means defending. So great. That's great language right there. It's exactly right. And that's the first thing to notice, is that this is an extension of the same principle. Police activity, policing, is an extension of the same principle. If there is, as Bastiat said in the law, if there is a collective organization of the right to lawful defense, well, then the police just are those public servants. This is crucially important to avoid the two extremes that you see today. The two extremes of, and you don't get mad at me at first, okay? You get mad at me later, just hear me out here. These can be extremes at least. Defunding the police versus back the blue. Libertarians would say, to people that want to say defund the police, they say, well, why don't you just defund government? Or at least, that's another story for another day, though. But, or back the blue. Now, why would I even say that's two extremes? If the police are a necessary extension of this, we would at least, at a minimalist perspective, back the blue. Sure, yes we would. Yes we would. And so it's, especially in the inner cities, with the statistics in crime being what they are. And we haven't even talked about race yet, but in terms of black on black crime in inner cities and things like that, those that know statistically and those in those communities would tell you, no, we don't want to defund the police. Okay? And we've seen already the crime rates go up, skyrocket after those police have been stripped of certain abilities, which they already did in the inner city, but also funding. However, there is a way to treat these as two mindless extremes and not just one extreme. And that's what this represents. So over here I have in red states minus, blue states plus. What am I talking about there? Well, what I mean by that is in a red state, there's something that's going to function. But I put a minus there to say just having a red state, as citizens of Idaho know very well, we can't seem to ever elect a conservative governor, a real conservative governor. You just have a communist with a cowboy hat. And like, how'd that happen again? Well, have you taken a civics class? Civics, what's that? Okay. So I have red states minus, because just being in a red state doesn't necessarily guarantee you this. Likewise, being in a blue state plus. So in other words, it just takes that same ratio. Anyway, so what do the lines represent? Well, over here in this Genesis 9 circle, this is a dotted line over here, as it should be, because that means it's open for the right of self-defense. It affirms the right of self-defense. He can still shoot out that way, right? That's what that line represents. You have a thin blue line, and you have the red to represent the red states, that the line that's stopping is facing this way. I'm stopping criminals. I'm there to stop lawbreakers. I'm not there to incapacitate law-abiding self-defense. Versus in the blue states, and completely the opposite. You're stopping them, and this is open to the mob. So let me give you the rest of the picture. The mob with a long arm of the government, and it doesn't matter what government is, it's just an outside government. And why the language outside? Well, let's talk about that. The sheriff, that's this guy over here. And by the way, don't assume, and Florida did a great job yesterday, at least it's a great start. I would have gone much further. But Governor DeSantis over there he took a first step toward what I'm going to ask for in just a second. Where they're going to defund any of the locales that defund the police. They're going to punish them. And they're going to hold them accountable. And the sheriffs are going to get up there, and one sheriff, the president of the Sheriff's Association in Florida, got up there and said, if you want to be safe, and if you want us to keep you safe, you have to vote for sheriffs that believe in that believe in their constitutional oath of office. And what I'm going to do is suggest that citizens need to hold their law enforcement, their feet to the fire. But what Florida did is they took an initiative in communicating in that direction. What's going on here? What is a sheriff? Well, you can look at this etymologically. You can look at this historically. There's an interesting study there. In early England, this sheriff was, and it comes from the word for shire. Now, in the Swiss, you had the cantons. Now, it's a bigger area, I understand that, but in our articles of confederation, our states were the same kind of thing. At any rate, it was a locale versus a larger group. The locale came first, always. In every event, they were the tribes and so forth. And the sheriff was just sort of the chief. In fact, the old English word for that, garifa, which morphed into reeve, and that was sort of that suffix. He became a servant. Think of the Robin Hood thing. The Sheriff of Nottingham. Who was he? Well, he's not what we're going to suggest. He was just a hired goon for Prince John. So that doesn't really count, right? Okay, what we're talking about is someone who's the head, the chief, like in the old Westerns. He was there. The English tribes went to war when it was in their local interest. When an outside violator of the peace entered, this reeve, this chief of the shire, sounded the alarm, sort of Paul Revere style, for the male citizens to take up arms and join under his command. That principle was called in the Latin posse comitatus. Comitatus would be the real Latin, but we've borrowed from that. That literally means something like power of the county. Now, you may recognize that that term because we have a law passed in 1887, the Posse Comitatus Act, and that was that's something that limits the power of the federal government to call on the military to subdue domestic disturbances. The trouble is that that intent can easily be turned on its head by a cleverly devised Marxist insurrection, as is happening at this very moment. Okay? Now, my point of bringing that up is not to say that because they've twisted that, therefore Trump should do X, Y, and Z different, which I think he should do at least X and Y different. Okay, but that's not really the point here. The real point is that this was a natural principle of the sheriff and his duty in the locale. And where have we seen that before? Well, that just mirrors the role of government to defend its citizens from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And in this case, we're talking about a foreign enemy, which I'm just defining as anything outside, from outside violence. Nothing too weird going on here. Okay? And so I mentioned those extremes, back the blue and defund the police. Well, sheriffs and police forces can maximize the community's support for them. And I don't want to be condescending here, but I want to say both to communities and to law enforcement. So I'm not picking on anyone. I'm just talking to everybody here. Something we tell our kids when they're young. Use your words. This goes all the way up to President Trump. Our government is the most inarticulate government in the face of the earth. I mean, in human history. We're just getting worse and worse at just clearly communicating. We don't have an open government because we don't have an intelligent, articulating government. And same thing with the citizenry. We get exactly what we are as citizens. But if you want safety and peace and a police force that is backed by the community, you can take the lead, as many sheriffs have done, in communicating their constitutional duties and the responsibilities of the people to prepare to defend themselves against invasion. You know, just being in a red state doesn't guarantee this. I don't remember the numbers, but if you and people won't even do this, you need to, your questionnaires, your voter guides, such as there are anymore, have to focus on the sheriff and ask the question, will you turn guns against American citizens? Will you uphold your office? Will you simply be a shill for the federal government, for George Soros? And this is a moment of calling people on their bluff and not accepting some answer that's just meant to shoo you away like a fly. Okay? So communities where that's not happening can take the lead. Whenever this is unclear from your sheriff, whenever this is unclear from your governor, whenever they would want to just shoo you away or laugh you off, you can organize town hall forums. You can live stream it to the community. Not as a condescending thing to the police, not something that mixes with the interests of those that, defund the police. That would be just a mob. So this is something that's meant to be supportive and to help the police, but at the same time, force whatever sheriff does not intend on upholding his oath, it'll expose that. Okay? So what you do is you get all the sheriffs on record answering this two-sided question. Will you turn your guns on your neighbors, on American citizens, on women and children, at the order of the federal government, or even at the order of your governor? In other words, flip side, the second question, will you uphold your oath of office and lead an armed defense of those aforementioned citizens, neighbors, women, and children who have done no wrong to the aggressors, who are presently planning their violence? Okay, so this closed line here, there was one video, and I don't remember where it was. It could have been Sacramento. I don't remember where it was, so don't quote me on that. One where a bunch of, what do you want to call them? Trump supporters, MAGA people, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. But ironically, they could have been just called Back the Blue pro-police people. And so there was an Antifa rally. Antifa was coming in, and here the lines were situated this way. And so in Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, and LA, up till now, and I think the police are pushing back, and that's good, but the police are essentially providing cover for BLM and Antifa. If you treat these as mostly peaceful protests, and Trump and Barr's hot air is just that, hot air, oh, they're a terrorist group. How do you treat terrorist groups? Unless it's just hot air. Oh, Matt, you don't understand Posse Comitatus. No, you don't understand. You're twisting the intent of that law, and you're twisting what's going on here. But we can come into more to show how that is in just a second. Okay? But what's going on there is the police are running cover for them as they march not only through the streets, but then into the suburbs. And they say, we're coming into the suburbs now. And they do come into the suburbs. And the police are just shielding them, but stopping them. And so in this video I saw, the Red Staters showed up, and they immediately started beating on Antifa. And immediately they started going the other way. It was just like Braveheart style, just beating them, just like a medieval warfare kind of thing. As far as I saw, there was no shots or anything like that. They're just beating on them. And my point is not to say yay to this violence or that violence. My point is to make a point here that the police instantly showed up and arrested all of the Red Staters that were pushing back that way. But those same police were not arresting these guys. They were providing cover for these guys into the suburbs. So the question is well warranted. You must not elect anyone. And if you have to write somebody into the ballot right now at this late hour, do that. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Because Red Staters are not allowed to think about this. You go to circus church where you leave your brain at the door and you're not allowed to talk about stuff like this. And then you wonder, how come there's another communist with a cowboy hat that just so happens to have an R on top of it? How is this happening? Well, you refuse to think about this. You kick those conversations out of your church. You won't form schools and join together to teach civics classes and things like that. But it's very simple. And in terms of what you can do, this is a back-scratching type thing for law enforcement and for the community. You can sell this as we want to support the police more. We want to hear from you how you're committed to keep us safe. We want to know from you how we can execute this in our local subdivisions, as small of an area as that. What's legitimate, what's not, you tell us. We'll work with you. And if they have no interest whatsoever, that'll start to come through. If they're not answering your questions, you just have people ask the same questions over and over and over again and force them to commit. Are they Nazis or not? Are they just agents for the Blue Reich, for George Soros? Or are they going to uphold their oath of office and defend the people in their locale and allow you to defend yourself? It's not enough for sheriffs to say, no, you got your Second Amendment rights. You can hide out in your house. Why are you hiding out in your house for another split second? Is this a terrorist organization or not? Is this a violent, premeditated mob saying, we're coming into your community with clubs and swords, we're going to light things on fire? If they're saying that, and if they start to do it, that's all I mean by preemptive. They're telling you, here we are, we're coming to kill you. That is a legitimate moment for law enforcement to take them out from the very beginning, from the moment they cross into the community. It's not legitimate. We've covered this, but apparently it needs to be said again. Don't allow CNN to tell you what a legitimate mob is or not. Mostly peaceful protests. Where in the Constitution to peaceably assemble? That's where in the Constitution, if you do want to talk about the Constitution. But this is really just a matter of natural right. It's just a matter of right and wrong and common sense. Force your law enforcement leaders to use their words, which you can't do if you won't use your words. We're going to have a future session where we talk about the problem with Christian nationalism and some of the Trump worship that's happening. I'm going to vote for Trump, but I'm going to vote for him for the same reason, I had a crude analogy for that, but I won't go there. But it's only as good as it buys you time to do the real thing back at the local level for the next 4 years. If you're just if you're just electing your favorite action figure for Washington, D.C. to drain the swamp, you've totally misunderstood how conservatism works, how liberty works, the principle of subsidiarity, which we talked about in a previous session. That is only there to buy time. And what you need to do is to stop thinking about politics as this blood sport where you just elect this dude and you hope from X thousand miles away that he's going to beat back the violent forces indefinitely. And we'll talk about that, the immorality of forced blood sport collectivism, whether it's on the left of socialism or whether it's on the right of nationalism. We're going to talk about the immorality and the violence of thinking about politics that way. There's a peaceful solution that ends all this stuff overnight, and a lot of it has to start at the local level, especially in the next few weeks. So that's all we'll talk about now. There's the picture, and hopefully that clears it up as far as what we mean by preemptive force, and that's actually going to save lives and bring peace sooner than later. So we'll expand this idea in the weeks to come.